So good afternoon. I'm sure glad I didn't have to do the singing piece from this morning. So glad to be here to be talking about successes in the medical device field. So the first sort of qualifier or disclaimer is that I'm actually fairly new myself to the device world, having come from the large PCORNet program that Rich described. So sort of have experience with really trying to implement research with messy electronic health record data, but have come to the medical device world with these fresh eyes, sort of looking at where the learnings and successes are in the medical device area and what might be able to be learned for when we look at the wider ecosystem. So, so again, the sort of the objectives that Greg gave me, which did not include singing, were talking about some of the successes in the real world evidence collection and use in the medical device world, and sort of looking at how they might be applied in the wider ecosystem. So that's what I tried to do in the presentation. So just, I mean, a few words. Again, I think now that I do work with medical devices, I'm struck by how little we talk of medical devices and how sort of widespread the sort of the drug sphere is. And so often, so as I've been sort of learning on the job about medical devices, there's actually a lot of information we really do need to know about medical devices, and better use of real-world data and real-world evidence is really going to kind of move us forward in that arena. So here are a few examples of devices where there have been issues, and when we think about really being able to access real-world evidence, use real-world evidence, it would help many patients and many future patients. Many of us will be looking at hip or knee replacements in the future. This is the example of the metal on metal hip implants, which took a while for the sort of community to realize that there were issues with these, and thinking about how we might better use real-world evidence today to sort of identify problems sooner and be able to conduct proper studies to see if there really is a signal there and something going on. So a few other examples, you may have heard of the contraceptive device called eSure. There's a lot of press about this, there's a lot of noise, but again, we really do need real-world data, real-world evidence to ascertain whether there's an actual causal problem going on. Another device that's been in the news is the power morcellators for uterine fibroids, and again, use of real-world data and real-world evidence here would be really critical to help us make good decisions. So for some of you, this may be basic, but often, as I say, medical devices tend to sort of be forgotten in the conversation around that mainly focuses on drugs. And so I thought I would start with just a little bit of sort of 101 around the difference between medications and medical devices in this field. And the regulatory and clinical context is actually different for both, and so they end up having impacts on what we do with real-world data and how we generate real-world evidence in both areas. So for medications, the approval is at least 2 very large pivotal randomized control trials. For medical devices, the pathways can be different. They have something called pre-market approval and a 510K, which is a clearance that actually needs less data than these 2 large trials in the drug side. On the medication side, adverse events are required in approval. They have massive post-approval safety studies that are required. And they also, luckily, have something called the National Drug Code, which really allows researchers and others to identify them in claims and EHR. On the medical device side, there tends to be sort of smaller studies required. There's variable requirements for post-approval studies. And it's actually a very big challenge to identify brand-specific devices in the data, both in EHR and in claims. Something called the Unique Device Identifier has been around now for a few years. It's compulsory for the medical device manufacturers to use, but it's actually not compulsory for the payers or the health systems to use. So for a number of, for us to really be able to do these high quality studies that we speak of, The first challenge is that we actually have a very hard time identifying the brand-specific device. Another important and a differentiating factor for devices is that while there tends not to be a compliance issue like in drugs, for drug studies, there's what they call a learning curve issue. So for the physicians, surgeons that are actually implanting devices, there's the learning curve effect. So the more they do it, the better they get at it. So differentiating between issues that are linked to the mechanics of the device itself versus the way or the experience of the person that's been doing the intervention is an important factor that has to be accounted for in device studies. The current medical device surveillance system is pretty kind of old now, and it causes a lot of pain to a lot of people in the ecosystem. It's very hard to get a denominator right now. It's really dependent on voluntary reporting. So one area where the launch of real-world data and real-world evidence could really help in the device area is in really sort of really getting us into the next stage for medical device surveillance. Okay, so that was a quick 101. So there's generally consensus among most stakeholders in the medical device ecosystem that real-world data and real-world evidence can be transformational and already is transformational in certain areas. So there's no question about that. Everyone knows that it's here, that it could really serve patients and it could serve each stakeholder in different ways. So the question is, how do we really get there and how do we scale? Some of them, so in sort of working with the CDRH side of the agency, there's a lot of talk of what they call the pre-post market shift, so the ability to make faster approvals with the knowledge that there would be better data to collect and use and evaluate post-approval. So that's sort of the part of the vision is being able to sort of support that pre-post market shift. I talked a little bit about the MODS, the medical device reporting system. There's also real hope that with the implementation of these methods, we could get to automated surveillance methods and really sort of get a better handle on signals sooner. And generally, all this is to provide US patients with access to innovative, safe, and effective devices more quickly. So with all that said, in the latest FDARA legislation, which was signed into law sort of a couple of months ago, there was the creation of this entity called NEST, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, to sort of really pull together all these different strands and see if we could really move this medical device ecosystem forward in this area. So I'll just make a quick plug, and it's the only plug for NEST, which is the program that I run. And NEST is sort of, NEST has been, the concept of NEST and the vision of NEST has been around for a long time. And it's thought of as sort of as a catalyst to really support timely and reliable development of high quality real world evidence. The way we've been thinking about implementing NEST is establishing partnerships with a range of organizations and companies and collaborations that are going to be providing data and analytic solutions. So working on sort of all the lessons that we've learned in programs like PCORNet, working with sort of leaders in different health systems and different areas to really sort of pull together to be able to provide this solution to the medical device ecosystem. The word data curation has come up a number of times, and I think, to me, that's really one of the key challenges that we face is there is no data today generated in the course of clinical care that's research ready. That curation step, that quality assurance step is really critical. And part of NEST's role will be to make sure that any data that is used to support medical device studies has the necessary quality and uses the appropriate methodological and analytical standards that would provide confidence in the results of any real-world evidence studies. So that's just a few words about NEST. So when Greg and I spoke about this session, he asked me about the role of registries. So registries are sort of famous in the medical device ecosystem as sort of, and are sort of thought about as potentially providing the solution to a number of real-world evidence questions and studies. And it is so. And so I'll say that personally, I have a slightly different take on that. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But it was sort of interesting to hear that the registries have this sort of how would I say? Anyway, this sort of role in the medical device system. So they have, these registries have historically played an important role in the regulatory space for medical devices for a number of reasons, and including because some of the sort of the high-risk implants are expensive, and as part of their approval, the creation of registries was mandated. So there are examples of very high-quality registries out there. You've probably heard of the TVTR registry, the Transcatheter Valve Therapy Registry. It's run by the ACC, the American College of Cardiology, and the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. The ACC has about 10 cardiology registries that it runs. The Vascular Quality Initiative is a high-quality registry that's run by the Society of Vascular Surgeons. I'll also mention, so as to not stay only in the cardiovascular area, the International Consortium of Orthopedic Registries, or ICOR, which is a consortium of about 30 registries and international registries. So registries have been sort of part and parcel of the medical device ecosystem. They do provide high-quality data, and the registry movement in the medical device world is also moving towards what they call the coordinated registries network, which is a sort of a wider collection of different sources of data that are linking in order to provide answers around devices. So they include links with claims data, EHR's data, health systems, international registries, etc. So I'll continue talking about some of the successes of registries before I get to some of the challenges. It is true that they provide, certainly the ones that I mentioned, provide high quality and fit for purpose data, that they support both observational and randomized interventions, and possibly at a lower cost. So many of you will have heard of the TASTE trial, which is a device trial that was an embedded trial within a registry. And I do, sort of echoing this morning's conversation around observational studies and randomized trials, I mean, I think it's absolutely possible and needed to continue developing randomized studies, but particularly within these sort of lower cost data infrastructures now that we have the technical capabilities to do that. And then my third point here is it's also possible to deploy algorithms for automated safety surveillance. There's been some pilots that have been published in that area where, for example, the Delta study, where these automated signals are really sort of a step forward compared to the sort of the passive surveillance system, which has no denominator. Now, CDRH has done a lot of work in the past few years to start making actual decisions using real-world evidence. And here you have a list of some of the decisions that were made in 2017. So they made 15 post-approval studies, 1 continued access study, 8 pre-market studies, including labeling expansion, 7 post-market surveillance studies, and starting to use international registries for post-approval studies. So the work to use real-world evidence is already underway in the trenches. It's largely still linked to these registries, though. So here, sort of to get to sort of what I was asked to speak about, which is sort of what are the challenges, what is scalable. I'll say that. And I'll start by talking about some of the challenges that are really specific to devices. And the first thing I'll say is that, yes, these registries are great, but in my mind, they're just not scalable for the future. So we do have access to these wonderful registries at a cost. the idea that they would be usable for all kinds of devices and patient populations is not realistic or not advisable, I think, as we move forward. So they're perfectly fine at this point in time, but given the sort of the disruptive nature of some of the technologies that are coming online, the ability to use the cloud, the explosion of mHealth, all the lessons that we've learned in a number of the sort of the big national programs in the last 5 years, I think really are leading us to a place where these sort of single device registries are going to be part of the past, and that's sort of my sense of that. Continued device-specific challenges, as I mentioned, the lack of unique device identifier in EHRs or claims, so it's actually difficult to do studies where you can identify brand-specific devices. It is possible to identify classes of devices, but if you're working on regulatory submissions, that's a problem, and we've had to do a lot of work. There has to be workarounds in a number of the studies in order to be able to deploy this. And then the final device-specific challenge that I've already mentioned is that impact of operator characteristics and learning curve. So there is actually a lot of things going on when a device gets implanted with a patient that are not necessarily linked to the device, and we have to have good methods in order to be able to differentiate that. But back to sort of ecosystem-wide challenges, I mean, I'll say it was nice to hear sort of both my two presenters before me really talk about what it's like in the trenches to do this work. I mean, this work is hard. The promise of real-world evidence is there, but the work to really sort of curate data, make sure that the data is robust, that the study is robust, that's still real work that has to happen in the trenches. And I think, you know, we're getting closer to that promise, but there's still a lot of work to be done on the methods, on the data linkages, on the lack of data in the case of some of the devices. I also mentioned my pet peeve, which are the administrative issues that plague some of these studies. So it takes a long time to do contracting for research studies. It takes a long time to get legal review. It takes a long time to get IRBs on board. And the privacy and security concerns, sort of the governance issues around doing these kinds of studies are still real. So we as a community still have a lot of work to do to accelerate and work on these barriers. So my final slide, so I think, I mean, there's no question that the future lies in the use of real-world data and generating robust real-world evidence. I mean, I think the question is sort of how far in the future that lies. I was thinking about how sort of first iPhone appeared in 2007. So if you take a 10-year-old in 2007, they're just going into college now. And in 10 years, they'll be graduating from medical school. So I sort of think about it as the digital natives are really going to be in the workforce working in this field in 10 years. So we're sort of still the pioneers in many ways, I think, in many respects. And the digital natives will be able to really, I think, deliver on a lot of these promises. So my conclusion is, I think there's been tremendous progress in the last decade. I mean, and even from when I started at PCORI and PCORNet, there's just sort of the acceleration of the technology, of the lessons, of the collaborations between the different stakeholders. I've listed here some of the studies and programs that have taught us a lot and will keep teaching us a lot. Sentinel, Patients Like Me, PCORNet, the All of Us initiative, the Salford Lung Study, the Adaptable Trial, and I put a plug in for myself here at the bottom, NEST. I think there's many strides on the technical side, so both the EHR adoption, the cloud. There's a lot of changes in the cultural aspects. Patients are much more involved in many aspects of this, and in some ways they can sidestep some of the historical barriers and infrastructures that have made this so expensive and so slow. But we're not quite there yet. And I'll conclude by saying I think the current barriers are still real. I mean, we had barriers 5 years ago when we started PCORNet. A lot of these barriers are still there. And how quickly we can overcome them as a community interested in this will be a factor both of sort of time, resources, and then leadership. So that's it.